Hello and welcome to another edition of the Liberty Day Institute's Visiting Scholars Program. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, president of the Liberty Day Institute, here with Colorado Secretary of State Wayne Williams. Wayne, it is great to see you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Jimmy, thanks for the opportunity. Love to talk about these issues.
We're going to talk about education from the perspective of the voting rights, something that you have to deal with. What exactly does the Secretary of State do?
So in Colorado, the Secretary of State actually does several things. We handle business licensing, we handle charitable gaming, we handle all sorts of other issues, nonprofits and charitable solicitations. But probably the most important thing we do is we oversee the elections process. And of course, America is founded on a concept of a democratic republic, which means that people get to choose their elected officials, and then those elected officials make decisions. And our job in the Secretary of State's office is to ensure that everyone who has the legal ability to do so is able to cast a vote and have their voice heard. And that's critical because in Colorado, we have some very close elections. That's why you see candidates campaigning. That's why you see those political ads. But it's also critical because those decisions you make at the ballot box can make the difference. In fact, Jimmy, we had two elections a couple falls ago decided by a single vote in the county where I was the county clerk. A single vote? Yep. After the recount. So two school board elections. And of course, school board's really important because they determine policies and all sorts of things with respect to the students, and that affects property values for homes, so lots of importance there. But we had two school board elections decided by a single vote.
That's remarkable, and it goes to show the importance of participation. Before we get into some of the amendments to the Constitution that expanded the right to vote, I want to ask you about the importance of voting and participation as a citizen. Why is it important in your perspective, especially as Secretary of State of Colorado, for people to be involved in the political process?
Well, the way you affect change in a democratic republic is by the vote, is by being involved, by voting yourself, and by encouraging other people around you to vote. And that's how you're able to make the change. And whether it's expanding a highway or changing a government program or allowing more freedom in a particular area, those are things that you as a voter have the ability to do. And you do it by exercising that right to vote.
Now, when we talk about the right to vote, it wasn't always the case that everyone 18 and older was able to have the right to vote. We began in a situation where there were fewer people who had the right to vote. It was primarily white males that were able to vote above the age of 21. There were a lot of things that expanded that right over time.
And folks also had to own property.
Yes.
In some of the original concepts. And so it varied, and originally started with something that was very much determined by the states. And over time, the federal government has expanded that franchise through constitutional amendments. Following the Civil War, the Republicans in Congress insisted on a number of amendments to the federal Constitution that both abolished slavery and ensured the right to vote for everyone, regardless of color.
And that was in the 15th Amendment to the Constitution.
15th Amendment's what officially expanded the franchise. For a number of years, that was the case. And then a number of states, primarily out here in the West actually, began to say, you know, women also ought to be able to vote in this process. And so following World War I, Congress then proposed an amendment to the states that would allow women to vote in all elections, and not just in the states that had allowed it previously, but across the board. And that was again adopted, and so the right was expanded again. That was an important step because it ensured that both men and women were able to vote, as well as all races, which had already happened to the 15th Amendment. Then, during the Vietnam War, there was a discussion of, well, people are having to go away to fight, and if they're fighting for the country, they ought to be able to vote. And so a separate amendment was proposed to lower the voting age down to 18. And so that was also passed by the states. And each of those went through the full constitutional process. And we haven't had that many amendments to the U.S. Constitution, but a number of them have dealt with the expansion of voting rights.
So out of 27 amendments, there are 3 that specifically expanded rights to new groups of people that hadn't been given those rights originally. And then there were some others, particularly the one dealing with the poll tax associated with Jim Crow laws down in the South.
So there was also a movement then when you said, well, everyone gets to vote, with some states trying to restrict that ability, or some localities trying to restrict that ability. And they did it through, well, you must pass a literacy test, for example. Or you can only vote if your grandfather voted. Or you can only vote if you pay a tax to do that. And so over the time, the U.S. Supreme Court has struck down a number of those provisions based on the general principles of the Constitution. But there's also a specific constitutional amendment that says you can't charge someone to vote. And so there's no poll tax. And so my office does not run on election fees because we don't charge taxes. We don't charge any fee to exercise your right to vote. You have the ability to return your ballot in a number of different ways. You can choose to mail it, but you don't have to pay that postage. You can drop it off at a site as well. And so there's no requirement that you pay anything in order to have the ability to vote.
We've been talking to Colorado Secretary of State Wayne Williams about this book, the U.S. Constitution, particularly the 15th Amendment, expanding the right to vote to people of all races and colors, the 19th Amendment, expanding the right to vote to women, the 24th Amendment, forbidding the poll tax on elections, and the 26th Amendment, expanding the right to vote to everyone above the age of 18 and older. So Secretary of State Wayne Williams, why is it important for us to understand the history of expanding the franchise?
Well, I think sometimes people take votes for granted. They act or they don't recognize the importance of each of these things. And of course, this nation was founded on the ability for no taxation without representation. It was one of the cries during the Revolution. And so this nation was founded on the right to vote, and it's been consistently expanded to include lots of different folks. And it's important to recognize where that comes from. It didn't just show up. It showed up because people were willing to fight for it. People were willing to speak up. People were willing to say, we need a change, we need to expand that ability to vote. And we need to make sure that everyone who's affected by the decisions has the ability to vote on those decisions.
And the role of the Secretary of State, among others, is to make sure that elections are fair, open, and that the process established in the Constitution is followed.
And as Colorado Secretary of State, I'm committed to ensuring that every Coloradan with the legal ability to do so has the opportunity to vote. Now, it's a free country, so everyone has that choice. But if you want to affect change, be involved in the process. And you know, Jimmy, it's important to note that even if you can't vote yet, if you're too young, you still have the opportunity to affect change. In fact, I first got involved in politics when I was a kid in high school. I wasn't 18. I couldn't vote.
Me as well.
But my peers all took the opportunity to get out of school on election day, and we actually worked the polls. We passed out literature to everyone, and we were able to change and obtain a better school board, a better board of supervisors that made the decisions for our educational future. And we did that even though most of us couldn't even vote. And so you can make a change, you can make a difference, and you can be involved in the process, and you can start right now.
Wayne Williams, Secretary of State, thank you so much for taking the time here for our Liberty Day Institute Visiting Scholars Program. We really appreciate it.
Jimmy, thank you so much for coming in.
Have a great day, and you as well have a great day. Thank you so much for watching the Visiting Scholars Program of the Liberty Day Institute. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, signing off.